Intel's Arc Battlemage B580 GPU launches tomorrow for $250. It's trying to fight the 300 class 4060, and the card is already massively improved over Alchemist. The first attempt at Arc, pretty low bar, but it's hugely improved, which is good to see. So we're going to be benchmarking this today. It's in a much better spot than the last round. By price, the B580 is positioned to compete with NVIDIA's RTX 4060 $300 card and AMD's price parity RX 7600 at $250. Both NVIDIA and AMD have new GPUs launching in early 2025, so obviously we have no idea how those will perform. We don't have them. We can't account for them today, but that is something you should keep in mind if you're looking at buying a GPU sometime soon, because there's going to be more numbers on all that whenever they launch. What we can say, though, out of the gate is that the B580 is far more reliable than the Alchemist cards were at launch. Intel has definitely improved. It still has issues, and it was still shipping driver updates until the last minute of testing, but the company has objectively improved. Frame times have largely been smoothed over. They do, however, remain a potential pain point for Intel in some games. Idle power consumption is also a pain point. It's a bit high. However, overall value and throughput are competitive, and ray tracing performance is particularly competitive, especially against AMD. What's really interesting here, and that you're going to see in the review, is we found the B580 does particularly well as the resolution increases. So the 4060 and the 7600 versus the B580, they diverge as the resolution increases, where the B580, if it has a lead, it continues to gain a lead at, say, 4K, and likewise, it starts to lose that lead at 1080p. And in situations where it's not ahead, it's able to sometimes help close that gap as the resolution increases, with the one big downside being, if it can't really quite play at those higher resolutions, it ends up being mostly an academic exercise, but it really just depends on the game. So it's a really interesting review. This is packed with information. I'm excited about it because we have a complete overhaul of our GPU test bench, and we'll talk about that today as well. It's on a 9800X3D overclocked. Let's get into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermaltake and the Tower 600 case. The Tower 600 is a vertical case design with Thermaltake's unique showcase presentation, which stands out further with its separate chassis stand kit that rotates the case for an angled showpiece. The Tower 600 is heavily ventilated around the sides, has a ton of radiator support, including up to 420mm solutions, and offers 2 GPU mounting options for display and cooling optimization. It also comes in colors not commonly seen in cases. Learn more about the Tower 600 at the link in the description below. All right, so keeping in mind that the 50 series is apparently around the corner and whatever RDNA thing is up next should be as well, let's get a quick refresher on the pricing today. Right now, when we're filming this, the B580 has an MSRP of $250 and was already available on pre-order on Newegg at this price. The prior Intel A770 is still available for $230 to $280 for the 16GB model. The A750 is at $200 to $240. The A580 is at about $170. NVIDIA's RTX 4060 is a main competitor today, typically at $300, alongside the RX 7600 at price parity with the B580. Those will be the two key comparisons we really focus on here. One step up, the 4060 Ti 8GB and 7700 XT are both around $400 to $420 right now, making them primary upgrade options one step up. Now, we already covered the B580 specs in a separate video. We'll link that below if you'd like to learn about that. The basics are on the screen in this slide. The card launches ahead of the B570, which will come out next month. The B580 is a relatively small 20xe2 core configuration on the Battlemage architecture. That makes it smaller than the A750 or the A770 in configuration size. Intel hasn't yet announced any 700 series cards in the Battlemage series. The B580 has a 190-watt default TDP. It runs, at least this one, on a single 8-pin power connector. Of course, board partners can kind of do whatever they want. And it's cut down to PCIe 4.0 by 8. That is a potential downside for people on old platforms, but that's something we'd look into separately in the future, not in this video today. Some basics on the test bench and methodologies. First of all, we have a complete overhaul on our GPU test bench. We've moved from an overclocked 12700K, which served us well for a while. Who would have known that would have been the best CPU Intel would launch for years. But we moved from that to a 9800X3D. This actually marks the first time in our 16 or so year history that we are using AMD as a permanent GPU bench platform for the CPU. And that's just because the 98X3D is so unbelievably fast. that it allows us to unbind the GPU wherever possible and try to make sure we have the headroom to hit the high frame rates without bumping off of a CPU bottleneck, at least in as many situations as it's realistically feasible. So that's great, gives us a lot of room to run tests at lower resolutions. And the 9800X3, we have overclocked to 5.4 gigahertz. We are running it under a 420 millimeter Arctic Liquid Freezer 3, which allows us to run higher clocks without any heat issues. And then our games list includes these. Not all of these are shown in each review, but they are all tested. We've added Dragon's Dogma 2 from 2024, Black Myth Wukong from 2024, Baldur's Gate 3 from 2023. Now this one will cut for the high-end GPUs, like if there's a 5090, but it's a good match for the B580. Starfield from 2023, Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail edition from 2024, Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty from 2023, and all the others you see on this list. We've tested about 25 GPUs for this launch. That list does not include the RTX 4080, the 4080 Super, the 4070 Ti or Super, the 7900 XT or GRE, and similar high-end cards. You can find scaling data in our prior benchmarks for those, like in the Super Series reviews. We added the 7900 XTX and 4090 just for a ceiling, and the reason for the cuts is time. It's rolling into the end of the year, and with travel and everything, we had to make some decisions on what we wanted, and what we decided was it made more sense to us to accommodate the GTX 1060, the GTX 1070, the GTX 1650 to try and give a clearer picture for people who might be upgrading. We do have that data for you. You'll just check our 40 Series Super reviews for all of that to get the scaling roughly. It won't be comparable to the B580 here today, but in most cases it doesn't matter. We'll add those as we go, especially into January with the high-end stuff launching. So it's all coming back. You just got to give it for the next round. As far as cards with multiple VRAM configurations, we ran what we consider to be the default or the first launched VRAM config whenever an option was present. And then finally on the side of the test bench, we've added power efficiency testing and idle power consumption testing with calibrated tools for this round. This is the first time we're really doing this in depth for GPUs. Now, we have a lot more to test still. This video is huge already. I have to get on a plane in a couple hours to go visit Der Bauer. You'll learn more about that soon. And enough setup, let's just get into the benchmarks. Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail is up now at 4K first. At 4K, the Intel Arc B580 ran at 47 FPS average, with lows exceptionally close to the average. The B580 has a staggering lead of 28.6% over the RTX 4060, which is elevated as compared to its lead at 1440p and 1080p. The RTX 4060 is behind in lows also, although they remain consistent and proportional with its average. The B580 also leads the 4060 Ti at 15% ahead, the A770 at 16.5%, A750 by an impressive 28%. The RX 7600 is around the same price as the B580, but struggles at 4K in this test at about 32 FPS average. Users of the GTX 1060 6GB card would experience an uplift of about 193% moving to the B580, with the 1070 seeing 110% and the 3050 similar. As we saw in our 4060 review, the 3060 Ti has a massive memory bandwidth advantage over its successors and embarrasses the 4060 and 4060 Ti cards here. From what we've tested lately, that's better than the B580. That list includes the $450 to $480 7800 XT at 22% improved, and the RTX 4070 non-super at 27% better among the flagships. Of course, everything above these that we didn't test this round would also be superior. At 1440p, the gap narrows in some places. The B580 is running at a completely playable 86 FPS average with good lows. Its lead over the lower cards has decreased, so it's 3.4% against the 4060 Ti, 9% against the A770, down from 16.5%, 19% over the A750 and the RTX 4060, which is down from around 28% before, and 31% over the 7600. The 7800 XT jumps up to 40% lead from 22% previously, so it's gaining ground over the B580. The 4070 jumps to 36% from 27% previously. The $400 RX 7700 XT leads at 98 FPS average to 86 FPS average on the B580, but is more expensive. The B580 looks good here overall, despite a reduction in its lead from 4K. 1080p squishes everything together and reduces the B580's advantage. The B580 at 124 FPS average is now just 10 FPS ahead of the A770 and RTX 4060, or about 10%. The B580 went from 28.6% lead at 4K to 19% at 1440p to now 10% at 1080p over the 4060. Previously, the 6700 XT was marginally below the B580, and in this chart, 1080p, it's ahead. The B580 also had nearly a 15% lead over the 4060 Ti in our first chart, but now is behind. The 4060 Ti leads at 133 FPS average, or an advantage of 7.6%, which is a pretty huge swing. Starfield is up now, tested at 1440p. The B580 isn't as strong in this one as it was elsewhere. Starfield is also a game that was not functional in Arc at launch, so running it all is already better than last time, though that's a low bar. The B580 ends up behind the 7600, the 4060, the 4060 Ti in this benchmark. It's beating the A770, the A750, and A580 cards from Intel's last gen. The 4060 leads by about 17%, with the 4060 Ti in an insurmountable 42% lead. The 7600 is closer, at 5% ahead. The biggest downside here for Intel is frame time pacing. Intel's B580 struggles with 0.1% lows and 1% lows comparatively, which are indicative of a deeper per-frame problem that requires a frame time plot to investigate. We'll explore that later in this video closer to the conclusion. At 1080p, the B580 ran at 51 FPS average, giving the RTX 4060 a 10 FPS average lead, but an even bigger lead in lows. Although the 4060 has an advantage of 21% in average frame rate, the real difference is in frame time pacing that we'll see closer to the end. The RX 7600's lead is now 4%, with the 4060 Ti at 44% ahead. Intel's B580 leads the A770 by an impressive generational 16%, despite a lower core count configuration. That's a huge improvement for Intel against its own stuff. Its lead over the A750 is 27%. Despite these gains, the B580 is not that competitive in Starfield. Let's move on to the next one. Resident Evil 4 at 4K is pretty interesting. The B580 roughly matches the 4060 Ti, with a marginal deficit on 0.1% lows. The lead over the 4060 is massive, benefiting the B580 by 31% in average FPS. It also holds an advantage in lows. The lead over the 7600 is 24%, with the generational lead over the A580 and A750 alike impressive. This is a strong showing for Intel's B580. At 1440p, the B580 maintains a competitive position. The card is fully playable at 85 FPS average with overall okay lows, albeit lower proportionally versus the neighboring A770 and 3060 Ti. With the resolution drop, the 4060 Ti now leads the B580 by 7% from its rough equivalents before. B580 benefits from its memory bandwidth at 4K. The lead over the 4060 is reduced to a still noteworthy 22.5%, down from 31% previously. The 7600 lead is reduced from 24% at 4K to 18% at 1440p. 1080p weakens the B580's overall position. The 4060 Ti now moves to 10% ahead. The B580's lead over the 4060 is reduced to 19%, but that's still a big lead. Most notably, though, we see the frame times deviate more from the average. The 128 FPS average is accompanied by 74 FPS and 63 FPS, 1% and 0.1% lows with the B580, whereas proportionally and based on neighbors, these figures should probably be closer to the 100 to 110 FPS territory. The drop jumps out as different from the rest. Baldur's Gate 3 is up now, one of the most played games in the last year, so Intel has to do well in these types of critically acclaimed titles. Last round, we saw that Intel did better in Vulkan with Baldur's Gate 3 than it did with DX11, but was still disadvantaged in both APIs. With DX11 and 4K Ultra, the B580 ran at 45 FPS average. The lows are reduced versus its immediate neighbors in the 4060 and 7600, both of which would be better experiences by frame times alone, despite all looking approximately equal in average FPS. This is another one for our frame time chart list at the end. The B580 improves on the A750 by 6%, the A580 by 21%, and it falls behind the A770 in this one. The Arc cards are generally less competitive in frame time consistency in this game, however, they have significantly improved in their performance from a year ago. Here's 1440p. The B580 ran at 74 FPS average, which is completely playable in this game. The lows are also acceptable in an objective sense. It's not a bad experience, but it's also not as good as you'd get for frame time pacing from the 3060, 4060, or 6600 XT. The 6600 XT's average frame rate holds a 14% lead, with the 4060 at 8% ahead, breaking rank from a roughly tied average at 4K. The 7600 also climbs ahead, now matching the 6600 XT rather than the B580 average FPS as we saw at 4K. The 4060 Ti is 35% ahead of the B580 with its 100 FPS average. Generationally, Intel improves over the Alchemist A750 by 7%, with a notable leap over the 62 FPS average of the A580. In Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty at 1440p, the B580 performs overall well. This is one of Intel's strongest titles. At 1440p and with ultra settings without RT, the B580 lands at 53 FPS average in one of our in-game tests within one of the cities, not the built-in benchmark. The B580 roughly matches the 3070, although is lower in 0.1% lows and frame time consistency. The B580 leads the 4060 in average FPS by 36%, the 7600 by a similarly large gulf, and the 4060 Ti 8GB model by 12%. The 4060 Ti has stronger 0.1% lows, but not in a way which we think is worth the cost trade-off. At 1080p, the B580 slips in the ranks below the 4060 Ti, which also carries a large advantage in 0.1% lows. The B580 technically leads the 4060 in average FPS by 18%, but the 4060 pulls ahead on overall frame time consistency. The 7600 is in a similar boat. Black Myth Wukong is next. This is one of the few games where we use the built-in benchmark. It's new to our test suite. It's been pretty consistent. Dropping settings would obviously increase the frame rate, but we're interested in the scaling here. At high settings, broadly speaking, the B580 still has a slight deficit in lows, but a far less noticeable one than in some of the other games. It's close enough to the 7600 and the 3060 that the experience would feel overall similar, although technically worse by measurement. The RTX 4060 holds a significant lead in this test, up at 19%, and 54 FPS average to 46 FPS average on the B580. Frame time consistency is also better. The 3060 Ti leads the 4060 and the B580, with the 4060 Ti at 65 FPS average, or 42% ahead of the B580. The B580 at least improved on the last generation at 29% over the A750 and 38% over the A580. Intel's making big generational strides against itself here. At 1440p, we're bordering on synthetic test territory for the B580, but what matters to us is the scaling, not the raw FPS. At 35 FPS average, the B580 allows the 4060 a lead of 6.6%, down from 19% at 1080p. This is a huge swing in favor of the B580, which continues to scale more favorably as resolution increases. It's just a question of whether it's actually playable at that resolution. The 7600 falls below the B580 in average FPS and is roughly the same in lows. The B580 also leads the prior generation flagship from Intel, the A770, which was at 30 FPS average. We're going to pick up the speed here now that the patterns are establishing. Dragon's Dogma 2 is up next. For our CPU testing, we benchmark inside the city to create an NPC workload on the CPU. For GPU testing, we test outside the city and in a GPU-heavy area with fields, water, and structures. At 1440p, the B580 ran at 44 FPS average with good lows. The GPU does much better here than in some of the prior tests, and it keeps up the pacing with the RTX 4060. The 7600, 4060, and B580 are all functionally equivalent in this grouping. The 3060 Ti benefits from its memory bandwidth and leads this group. This is a much better positioning for the B580 than the prior game. At 1080p, things shake up and knock the B580 loose from its rough equivalents with the 7600 and the 4060. Now, the 4060 holds a 13% lead, and the 7600 has an 11% lead. The B580 retains overall typical frame time pacing, which is good for Arc. It does manage to hang in there, but again, it's seen some losses as the resolution comes down. Dying Light 2 is next. This one looks pretty good for Arc, including frame time consistency. The B580 runs at 63 FPS average, which has it ahead of the 4060 Ti, the 4060, and the 7600. It's also ahead of these devices in 1% and 0.1% lows, in what's a major victory for Intel considering some of its challenges and losses in the other games. The B580 ends up between the 3070 and the 6700 XT. The $400 7700 XT holds a lead in average FPS of 12% here, despite being 60% more expensive. This is one of the stronger showings for Intel. At 1080p, the B580 continues its good performance by outmatching the A770 and the 4060. However, it loses ground to the 4060 Ti that it had outperformed at 1440p. The 87 FPS average is well into playable territory and carries good lows with it. The die size is also much smaller than an A770, so outperforming it is key here. Intel may be able to reduce some of its cost per card, which will help it compete long term. We're moving to ray tracing benchmarks now. These are not comparable to the rasterized counterparts. Resident Evil 4 is up first. This is a relatively light workload for ray tracing and isn't as distorted for one vendor or another as some games are. This first chart is at 4K with max RT, but with FSR set to quality for all devices. We validated other upscaling solutions across the RT suite, and we found that their performance is roughly identical between FSR, DLSS, and XESS where all three exist, or where even just two of them exist. So matching for just FSR agnostically allows us to control for image quality as well, which is a concern here. Because we're using FSR, it's not native resolution. We don't use FSR in our rasterized tests. Here's the 4K chart. The B580 ends up directly competing with the RTX 4060 Ti in the average frame rate and in frame time consistency, with lows overall indicative of a comparable frame-to-frame interval to the 4060 Ti. It's not far off from the 3070. Intel's B580 leads the RTX 4060 by 21% at 50 FPS to 41 FPS average. The improvement over the A750 is similar, and we need to run the 7600 back through this one still, but the 7700 XT and the 6600 XT give an idea for AMD positioning. Here's 1440p. In this test, the Intel B580 runs at 75 FPS average with overall good lows. The 1% and 0.1% metrics are similar to what we see on the 3060 Ti, which outperforms the B580. Intel's B580 manages to outperform the RTX 4060 still, but this time only by 6%, including proportional frame times. It also outperforms the A770's 71 FPS average, which was already relatively good for RT, especially for a basically first try last time. AMD's RX 7600 ran at 65 FPS average, giving the B580 nearly a 16% advantage, while costing about the same. The RTX 4060 Ti's 91 FPS average result outdoes the B580's 75 FPS average by 21% here, including scaling in the lows. The 7700 XT pushes further ahead, up at 106 FPS average, and both of these devices cost about 60% more than the B580 at around $400 plus or minus a bit for the 4060 Ti 8GB and the 7700 XT alike, as tested here. At 1080p and with the same FSR and RT settings, Resident Evil 4 positions the B580 now below the RTX 4060, though they're functionally tied. It's losing the advantage that we've now proven it typically has at higher resolution, so that behavior is repeating from rasterizing. These two and the RX 7600 are closest in price, with the 7600 down at 85 FPS average and allowing the B580 a slight lead of 9%. The 4060 Ti leads the B580 by 29%, with the 7700 XT 40% ahead of Battlemage. Overall, Intel's performance in this lighter RT test is competitive, especially for price and in comparison to AMD. Dying Light 2 is a heavier RT workload than the last one and is tested with FSR quality. At 1080p, the B580 ran at 65 FPS average and held consistent frame times. It's a little better than the A770 and similar in average to the 3060 Ti. The 4060 Ti leads the B580 with its 73 FPS average result, a gain of 12%. The B580 leads the 4060 by 13%, and AMD falls behind in this test with the 6700 XT now below the B580 and the RTX 4060. The B580 ends up with nearly a 30% lead over the 6700 XT, which is a precarious spot for AMD. The lead over the RX 7600's 45 FPS average is 44% here. In Dragon's Dogma 2 with max RT and no upscaling, the B580 ran at 44 FPS average with lows slightly lower than where they should be. The A770 leads the B580 in lows and ties in the average. AMD's RX 7600 does better here than in Cyberpunk and Black Myth, up at 53 FPS average and outranking the B580 by 20%. The RTX 4060 also outdoes the B580 and also outperforms the 7600's frame time pacing, landing at 54 FPS average. Battlemage is doing okay, but it doesn't have the same advantage it has in some of the earlier tests. At 1440p and RT with Dragon's Dogma 2, the B580 ran at 36 FPS average and had dips in lows compared to the neighboring prior generation A-series GPUs. The 7600 leads the card now by about 10%, reducing its lead at 1080p. The RTX 4060 is in a similar position, but with better lows. Cyberpunk with medium RT settings is less brutal on AMD than Ultra, something we showed in our last round of reviews, but remains one of the heaviest RT loads and disproportionately hard on AMD devices. This is tested without any upscaling. The B580 did overall well here. Its average frame rate was competitive with the RTX 3060 Ti, despite lower 0.1% lows than it. The 4060 struggles in this one with frame time pacing and is erratic and unpredictable with these settings. The B580 has a much better experience with the 3060 Ti and up even better still. The 4060 Ti also struggles with frame time consistency, as illustrated by the 0.1% lows that draw our attention to the problem. This appears to be an issue with memory bandwidth, especially as contrasted with the 3060 Ti, which likely compounds with the VRAM capacity. In a massive loss for AMD, the B580 runs 62% ahead of the RX 7600 in average frame rate, while also maintaining superior lows and frame time pacing. AMD's closest card is the RX 7700 XT, which is significantly more expensive. This is a repeat of what we saw with the Alchemist cards last time, where the A770 and A750 alike outperformed AMD's 6700 XT and 7600. We tried testing RT Ultra for Cyberpunk, but unfortunately the system hard locked with the B580 card for us. This behavior did not occur on any of the other 18 plus devices we tested with these settings, and appears to be related to Battlemage. Black Myth Wukong is up next. This is one of our experimental charts, which means we are still researching it and we're still vetting it. So it's not completely up to our full standards yet, but we are at a stage where we're ready to share the data so that we can start sort of poking at it to learn more as we continue to build on the GPU testing. We just try to be clear in the disclosures of our level of confidence for a new data set, so with an experimental chart, it's always a little lower. So this one is brutal on anything that isn't NVIDIA. Intel also had a last-minute driver update for ray tracing performance in this game, and at 1080p with FSR set to quality, using high raster settings and medium RT settings, the B580 ran at 34 FPS average, with lows where they should be. Intel's last-minute driver change did nothing to our results. They were nearly identical, so we're just showing one set here. We're not sure what Intel thinks it changed, but it did nothing for us. The B580 ranks alongside the RX 7800 XT, as AMD has serious difficulties with this game. Wukong is similar in performance to Cyberpunk for the characteristics of behavior on AMD, where even a 4060 outperforms a 7900 XTX. For Intel, it at least is doing better comparatively than AMD, but NVIDIA has a stranglehold here. We'll move to some quick zoomed-in shots of the frame time charts for some good and some bad scenarios for the B580. There's a lot to look at here, but we're just going to look at a couple. We'll start with Baldur's Gate 3 at 4K. This chart shows the frame-to-frame interval on the vertical axis and the frame on the horizontal axis. Lower is better, more consistent is best. Although the B580 at times is lower than the 4060, the card experiences occasional but massive excursions from the previous frame. We're seeing some jumps upwards of 20 milliseconds, which is noticeable, but not necessarily game-breaking. It depends on the frequency of them. In this case, you'd notice they do occur frequently enough that it'd pop out. Arc has improved substantially from Alchemist in this specific regard, but it's clear that Intel still has work to do in at least DX11 with this game. Dying Light 2 rasterized is one of the better scenarios for Arc, so we'll balance by looking at that as well. In this one, the B580 had better frame times across the entire bench pass. It's lower overall, but also doesn't experience any major unexpected deviations. Unlike the previous Baldur's Gate chart, the B580 GPU is exceptionally consistent in its frame time pacing here. The 4060 ends up worse of the two devices tested in this chart. In this next one, NVIDIA and its RTX 4060 are a victim of its own creation. In Cyberpunk with RT Medium, the RTX 4060's frame buffer and memory bandwidth cause it to struggle, resulting in frame time spikes that, in one case on this chart, exceed 120 milliseconds. That's 1/10 of a second you're looking at the same frame. This massive spike would result in a stutter in-game. These stutters were repeatable during play. There's another large spike later in this run, and then they also happen frequently in our other runs. The B580 did not exhibit this behavior in this test, and would be a better experience. Intel's memory choices benefit the company here. Bandwidth is one of them, but capacity also contributes. Starfield had some major consistency issues run to run for Intel, so we're actually only showing Intel for this. This shows two test passes from Starfield at 1080p for the B580. In this one, you're seeing wildly inconsistent frame pacing with a total range from 13 to 53 milliseconds. There's no pattern to it, and frame delivery is overall erratic, making the experience less consistent and allowing more micro-stutter behaviors to emerge. Dying Light 2 looked much better for Battlemage. Final Fantasy XIV's up next. In this one, the B580 did well overall, but had slightly reduced 0.1% lows versus the 3060 Ti and the 6700 XT as you saw in our previous bar chart. However, it did better than the 4060 across the board. In the frame time chart for Final Fantasy, we see an incredibly flat line with only one major spike that would hardly be noticeable since it isn't repeating. Let's move on to efficiency. Now we're getting into the power consumption and power efficiency measurements. This part's actually really cool because we've totally overhauled it for this. It's a huge rework. It's actually something people have been requesting for a long time. So we're excited about it. We're taking a lot of our learnings from CPU power efficiency testing and we're applying them to GPUs. This is something we consider in experimental status. That means that the charts and the data, although they meet our publishing standards, it's all new methodology, it's new testing, it's a new approach. So that means that it hasn't been through as thorough of a public vetting process as our other data. So let's get into it. For this testing, we're using a PMD2 hooked into a PCIe slot interposer, and the PCIe cables are 12-volt high power. This PMD2 has been personally calibrated by Elmore from Elmore Labs for our work upon request, and we've had it validated against other measurement devices, including current clamps. We're isolating for just GPU power here, so this eliminates all other test bench power draw. This allows us a clean and isolated feed of GPU behavior. We haven't yet tested our full lineup of GPUs because this is all brand new testing, so we only have some of the most relevant cards. You'll have to check back as we add more. This chart is for idle power draw on Windows desktop and without any GPU tasks active. The Intel B580 pulled about 35 watts when idle at desktop, which is a lot less than the Alchemist GPUs pulled, up at 46 watts, 45 watts, and 43 watts. But it's still higher power than everything else. Intel still has an idle power consumption challenge to overcome. The RX 6600, for example, pulled only 5 watts through the PCIe slot and the PCIe cables combined when idle, which is impressive. The 6600 XT was similar at 6.2 watts. The 4060 is a relevant comparison and far lower in power consumption idle, down at 11 watts to the B580's 35 watts or so. This is an area Intel will eventually need to improve, but no one will care about its idle power draw if the performance isn't good enough to warrant a purchase in the first place. So we'll see if this improves subsequently. Idle GPU power has been requested by our audience for years, so we're happy to finally start delivering it with this first look. The next chart is for Baldur's Gate 3 efficiency at 1440p, looking at rasterization performance. This is measured in FPS per watt, which can be thought of as frames per joule, since it's just frames per second per joules per second. Higher is more efficient here. FPS per watt is easier to understand for most people, so we use that phrasing. In this test, the RTX 4060 Ti has the best FPS per watt performance, up at 0.71. The 4060 Ti is about 37% more efficient, meaning its FPS per watt score is 37% higher than the Intel B580. This is still a massive generational improvement for Intel, where its A580 previously was way down at 0.31. The B580 scores 68% higher in FPS per watt than the A580 and A750, which is near the 580. Its total power draw is about 141 watts here, the same as the 4060 Ti, and so the reason its FPS per watt is lower is because its frame rate is simply lower. The 4060 pulls 126 watts in this test and has a slightly higher frame rate, benefiting on both sides of the equation. We don't yet have the RX 7600 in this lineup. Now we'll look at one of the B580's best case scenarios to balance the two. This chart is for Final Fantasy XIV at 1440p, where the card did well. The B580 ends up 4th on our list so far at 0.51 FPS per watt, ahead of the 7800 XT and behind the 4060. The 4060 pulled 124 watts here, putting it at 0.58 FPS per watt, and almost 14% more efficient than the B580. That's a good spot for the B580, despite being less efficient and pulling more power at 170 watts. The 4060 Ti pulled just 129 watts, so it didn't leverage its total power budget and was 27% more efficient than the B580. Against the last generation, the B580 is significantly more efficient than the 6600 XT, the 6600, the 3060 Ti, and Intel's own Arc cards. The jump over the A750 alone is huge, especially since the Titan model from Sparkle here has a boosted power budget. At 1080p, the 4090 and 4060 Ti appear the same because the 4090 is completely CPU bound here. It can't perform any better, it doesn't have the room, but it remains in a relatively high power state. The B580 again ranks as less efficient than the 4060 and more efficient than the 7800 XT and below. The B580 pulled 161 watts here. In Black Myth Wukong at 1080p and without ray tracing, the B580 scored 0.3 FPS per watt and pulled 146 watts, which has it significantly behind the RTX 4060 at 0.4 FPS per watt and 121 watts. The 4090 would rank higher if it could fully stretch its legs for the same reasons we've already discussed. The B580 is about equal to the 7800 XT once again. In Phantom Liberty, with ray tracing and at 1080p, the B580 manages to hold on to its 4th place positioning in our current limited lineup. The lead over the 7800 XT is now a massive 29% thanks to AMD's performance issues in this title dragging it down. The 4060 maintains an advantage of 15% over the B580. What's clear is that Intel has drastically improved on its A-series performance. So Intel Battlemage is way better than Alchemist. It's a low bar, but it's a very important bar, because if you go look back at Alchemist, it wasn't good. It was not a good launch. The drivers were really terrible. The software was difficult to navigate. It was broken in a lot of cases. The overlay was one of the worst user experiences ever. They've removed the parts that really sucked with it. Now, there's some problems still, and there's going to be more that we won't find, because when you're 2 generations into a GPU architecture like this, or GPUs just period, I should say, this is going to be a community effort. It's going to take a lot of reviewers and a lot of users to really root out the key problems. But based on our Alchemist experiences, this is at least not like that. So Intel has kept the improvements it's made over the couple of years since Alchemist launched. We've covered those in follow-ups, and it's applied them here, which is a good thing to see. Now, this time around, we ran into a couple driver issues, but only one that completely prevented play. And again, that was in Cyberpunk. With RT Ultra, medium, it was fine. Without RT, it was fine. Some reason, RT Ultra in our test environment, the game just crashed. And that was something that Intel was able to confirm. They have some theories as to why it happens, but all we can really say is that out of the 18 plus cards that we tested with those settings, none of them had this issue except for Battlemage, and so we've just got to point to Battlemage because we're not able to reproduce it on anything else. But that was the only sort of major driver issue we had. We did have one time where it hard crashed, as in the whole system restarted, and we're not sure exactly what caused that or when it happened. But again, it was a one-off for Battlemage and nothing else. So anyway, those were the 2 major instances. Now, for an NVIDIA or an AMD launch, where they have been doing this for a long time, that would be very noteworthy. It's noteworthy here too, but for a different reason. Because 2 is like, I think last time we filed over 40 different bug reports and varying severity issues with Alchemist. So two's good. It's a big improvement. This review is already long, so let's keep it simple. Here's the key points. We observed that the B580 scales actually really well as resolution increases. So especially at 4K and the games that aren't heavy enough to eliminate that as an option, it was doing really well. Unfortunately, the card isn't so powerful that 4K is playable in a lot of these games, but the behavior was consistent with 1440p as well. At 1080p, we saw a loss of advantage or sometimes a flip in instances where the B580 was ahead of the 4060 or the 7600. It might then be behind them, but it was generally trading blows depending on the game, sometimes bigger gains or losses. Next, Intel's frame times are much better than they were. They avoid experience ruining issues in almost all cases. That is not a concern this time around. The Battlemage drivers still have some frame time pacing problems in some games and tests and are not overall superior, but they have improved enough that in combination with a low enough price point at $250 and below, they could be overlooked depending on the game you play. Also, as a downside, Intel's idle power consumption remains high. It has improved massively, but it's higher than everyone else when idle still for the most part. Intel's efficiency in actual gaming scenarios, at least when those games perform well for the Battlemage card, have improved significantly, and it's actually competitive in some situations with the likes of the 4060, with the 7800 XT, and things like that. Now, as the A750 went on massive fire sales previously, we'd sometimes recommend it with heavy caveating. And the main one was that we never really felt comfortable recommending it to the general mainstream audience because we feared that users without troubleshooting experience or those who have troubleshooting but either don't have a second GPU that's not Intel or patience would find it frustrating when encountering games that simply don't work. Starfield, for example, just didn't work when it launched on Arc. Now, looking back, maybe they were doing you a favor. Starfield, not the best received game. The point stands though. Battlemage has improved on this front. We feel much more comfortable in general with people buying a Battlemage GPU as opposed to Alchemist. However, we still have one major caveat, which is that this is still only the second true generation of Intel's modern DGPUs. So this is just my reminder to you all that we can only really report on what we've seen, and you have all the games we've tested, all the numbers. What we have seen so far is we were not really able to find, other than the instance I mentioned with RT Ultra and Cyberpunk, any sort of consistent experience ruining, like absolutely not, this is a problem, issues at a driver level like last time. Now, I am 100% positive they exist, and that's why this section's in here. So what you're gonna have to do is look around at some other reviews and see if anyone's dug anything up we don't really talk to a lot of reviewers before these launch. They're all embargoed anyway. So probably something's out there. That's going to be the nature of the beast for a couple generations with Intel's cards. It's going to be a fact of life. NVIDIA and AMD have had basically decades to get their stuff together, and Intel is just catching up. So that's just going to be how it is. But we did not have any major issues other than the one. And so we can only speak from our experience, which is that generally speaking, this is far better than it was. And I would feel a lot more comfortable saying that if the pricing makes sense when you're shopping and sort of pending what happens with the next generation, the B580 actually does make sense compared to some of its competition. Now, it's a little game dependent, but that's a far better position than Intel was in. So the B580 poses considerable value in some situations as compared to the RTX 4060 and the RX 7600. It's not always the best, and it does trade with these cards, but it's a serious competitor this time. We've got a lot more work to do with this, and we're definitely gonna be back with some more testing. Probably be doing a teardown of the card, and you have all the numbers at this point to dig through it. We'd recommend, again, looking at other people as well, in particular for this launch, just because of all the stuff we just talked about. So for what we've seen, the improvement is obvious, and that's a great thing. Now it's just gonna be a matter of continuing to follow up and seeing how it develops. We've got more to test, so check back for all that. The next big thing will be to see what happens in January with Intel's competitors. There's a reason they chose now to launch, and it was to get in front of all the new stuff. And depending on how greedy NVIDIA or AMD might decide to be at the price point and the class that the B580 is in, it could be either really bad for the B580 or really good for it. So we'll cover that as the time comes. But thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. I've got to get on a plane and go fly to see Der Bauer mit Acht. In the middle of the name, there's an Acht. So check back for that coverage as well. We'll see you all next time.